Ken, a warm welcome back to you to the show, and it's great to see you again, and congratulations on receiving the Liberty Medal.
Thank you, Ali. It's great to be with you.
You have spent a lot of time studying, and you and I have had some conversations thinking about some of this country's most tumultuous periods in history. You talk a lot about how it was more tumultuous during the Civil War. It was as tumultuous during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. I don't know whether it's worth any more the comparisons, but how are you thinking about the current moment as it relates to some of the worst moments we've faced in this country?
There seems something incredibly unprecedented about what's going on right now. The other times that you cited, and you can go back even further to our revolutionary period. I'm now in the process of finishing up a big series on the history of the American Revolution that will be out next year. You see civil war happening at our beloved revolution. Our own Civil War was a sectional war. But the peaceful transfer of power, the free and fair elections, the independence of the judiciary didn't seem in doubt. However, I think those of us who are historians and amateur historians, storytellers about the past, there's a kind of optimism that attends. You see a great faith. Lincoln was not supposed to be reelected in 1864 and was. The United States Army that he was the commander-in-chief of was not supposed to vote for him, and they did. And so I think what you have are very similar echoes, rhymes, Mark Twain would say, between these periods. But of course, each moment, as Lincoln pointed out, is unique to the present. And as he pointed out in a speech to Congress, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew, we must act anew, and then we can save our country. And so I think we can do a lot of historical speculation, a lot of parlor games about what ifs, but at the same time, we're dealt a certain hand of cards right now, which we have to respond to.
So let's talk about the various ways, we won't get through many of them, but the ways in which one can respond to it in the moment. At an event in Wisconsin on Friday, Liz Cheney, who is a very conservative Republican, suggested that a new political party might be needed going forward. She said, quote, "There is certainly going to be a big shift, I think, in how our politics work. I don't know exactly what that will look like. I don't think it will simply be the Republican Party is going to put up a new slate of candidates and off to the races. I think far too much has happened that's too damaging." When the Republican Party was formed in the 1850s, these are my words, by the way, it was a coalition of people who formerly belonged to other parties. So let's think about this. There may be some lesson in the realignment of politics and political parties in America, as opposed to the changing of the Electoral College, which is a truly hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's true, and while I'm not sure, I think there is so much entrenched and ingrained about the two parties that it's going to be difficult for the Republican Party to figure out a way to escape the specific gravity of the darkness that now engulfs it. I mean, this is a party, as you pointed out, Ali, born in the 1850s in a schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. They had one thing they were going to do out of the ashes of the Whig Party and other disaffected people who were gravitating to something new, is that they wanted the emancipation, they wanted the end of slavery in the United States. And that Republican Party has now morphed into some incredibly dangerous, almost resembling the know-nothings of that period that are racist and certainly anti-immigrant and sort of Abraham Lincoln is turning over in his grave that this still has the label of the Republican Party. And so I think we've got to count on Liz Cheney being right in a long term, that there's going to be some reconfiguration, that we are going to leave at least the MAGA base behind and hope that our country is able to create a kind of opposition that has the kind of values before. Remember, the great legislation in the 20th century involved not only Democratic but Republican votes, whether it's voting rights or civil rights or Medicare or Medicaid, even going back to Social Security. The Republican Party was always, from the beginning of the 20th century, an engine of of progressivism as much, if not more, than the Democratic Party. And states like Wisconsin were laboratories of experimentation in social ideas that would make government more responsive, level the playing field. Theodore Roosevelt is, of course, a perfect example of that kind of progressive in the White House. And so you can hope, in my office, I have a poster of the intertwining, snaking, paths that both parties have taken. One of the things that I think was beneficial to the Democratic Party, as much as it has challenged it since the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s, is that it has lost those people who are uninterested in following Jefferson's words, though he himself had some contradictions, obviously, that all men are created equal. All men and all people are created equal. And so I think there's a wonderful new coalition that is coalescing. And if you just step back and think about the odd couple of not just Liz Cheney, but her dad, crusty old, Dick Cheney, and Bernie Sanders are voting for the same person.
It is,
Bernie ought to be pulling a lot of those blue collar votes. And of course, it's hard to ignore Dick Cheney. He is not a rhino. He is not anything but a rock-ribbed conservative. And all of them and his daughter believe that the grave danger is another term of Donald Trump.
In 2026, America is going to celebrate its 250th birthday. Ahead of that, you'll be releasing a new documentary you were just mentioning about the American Revolution. You're going right back to the start. Tell me why you chose that as the subject of this film as America is approaching this milestone.
It was interesting, Ali, when the ink was not dry on the Vietnam film. We were still in the process of locking it when I said, we're going to do the revolution. And it wasn't with the eye towards the 250th anniversary. I did worry that in 2026 we might be sort of consumed by a kind of sentimental nostalgia, treacly fife and drum stuff, and that what was good is that the American Revolution started in 1775, so the 250th would come a year before for the actual beginning of the revolution, and that we could get to understand this period that we sort of protected. We accept the violence of the Civil War and World War II in Vietnam and the First World War, but we sort of think of the revolution as these guys thinking great ideas, and it is about that, but it's also an incredibly bloody civil war. And so I think it was the ability to try to dig deep and understand the complexities of it. We live in a modern media culture, no insult intended, Ali, in which everything is dialectically preoccupied. That is to say, it's red state or blue state, it's MSNBC or it's Fox. And I think that when you call balls and strikes, as we've tried to do in our films, you begin to realize that everybody has feet of clay. George Washington certainly does. And so there's no kind of perfect thing. You're not trying to attend to it. The patriotism, which is so important for Americans to have, is not just the last refuge of scoundrels, but a very complex self-examination. Judge Learned Hand said, liberty is never being too sure you're right. Could there be a better name for a judge than Learned Hand? And could there be anything better than that comment? Certainty is the enemy of everything. When we are certain about stuff, we've forgotten to understand that sometimes the opposite may also be true. So we have to tell a true, honest, complicated past that's unafraid of controversy and tragedy, but equally drawn to those stories and moments that suggest an abiding faith in the human spirit, and particularly the unique role this remarkable republic plays in the positive progress of mankind.
Well, that's interesting because when you were selected to be the recipient of this year's Liberty Medal, you remarked, quote, "There's nothing more important in a democracy than educating the public about its history." Now, on this show, we have been following the attacks on our country's education system, which often involves the banning of books and the disputes over curricula about our history in the past and our modern history. Are you concerned about that growing as a political pressure point in recent years? The idea of our history and how we teach it has itself come under attack.
Yeah, it's been politicized in such unfortunate ways, and of course, anybody is concerned about it. Listen, I can report back from the late 18th century that I know categorically what the founders meant by the pursuit of happiness. It isn't the pursuit of objects in a marketplace of things. It's lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. They felt if we were going to create this new thing, everybody heretofore had been a subject. If we're going to create these new entities, citizens, they had to lead a virtuous life. And to be virtuous was to constantly educate yourself. That's what it was about. And implicit in that was a kind of honest evaluation, not only of what has happened, what we know in science as well as arts and humanities, but what we don't know, where we fail, where we come up short. And so what you begin to see is that our experiment is all about future words. We're in pursuit of happiness and a more perfect union. We are a nation in the process of becoming. And unfortunately, what happens is when we gravitate to the certainty, we say, we don't need to teach this. Slavery is not that bad. We don't want to upset kids who are already participating in video games, being yelled at by coaches, being talked about damnation by pastors, being, engaged in a world in which they're as smart as the politicians who are trying to sort of slide us into some arbitrary, almost Soviet kind of thing in which all of a sudden somebody's picture disappears from the Politburo and they never existed.
Yep.
We can't do that. We were slave owners. We were born in slavery. The guy who said all men are created equal owned hundreds of human beings and didn't see the contradiction. If you do not own that, you do not have the possibility to escape the specific gravity of the negative things that have attended our history throughout. And our work is, and in this moment, no more important than it's ever been, is to escape the gravity of those things, to not go back, but to go forward, to quote a person in the news, turn the page.